conservation portion of the morning. This is a completely different gear, and for that matter, vehicle altogether. Talking about now, so I promise I'll keep it short and sweet. When it comes to billing, clearly that's not why we went in this profession. That's not what we do, really. So it stands to reason that it's something that me, especially being a younger perfusionist in the field itself, kind of stumbled onto, but because of my background that I'll talk about in a second, it kind of clicked, so it worked. And we made a couple changes, and they've worked pretty well so far. So I don't have any disclosures. Certainly open to it. We'll talk about the acuity-based charging here, the components of acuity-based charging, and I'll give a couple examples of how it works specifically. I'll explain our facility's process of implementing these charges. I know that's a big question mark here. And the benefits beyond just simply additional revenue. So I think it warrants stepping back from for a second when you put a number like that up on the screen. Just take another moment to think about that. So that is 1.37 million. That represents a number that is the difference at our facility between the 2016 billables for perfusion and 2017. So it's a single year difference in the way that we bill in our construct. So clearly, this is making a difference to the point that I've had meetings with our CFO and a couple of the other people on the board as well to make sure what we are doing is completely legal, if nothing else. So obviously, let's start with the details behind this. My inspiration primarily came with the fact that my background is holistically in ICU nursing. I was a nurse for about 7 years prior to becoming a perfusionist. It was all med-surg, trauma ICU, CV ICU, and then most recently, before I went back to perfusion school as an ECMO specialist, which is obviously what inspired me to become a perfusionist. What really sparked my interest and the connection between these two is that during my nursing career at one of the facilities, the way that we assigned nurses to patients was based on their illness, based on their acuity factor. So we developed an entire point scale based on how ill they were, and that was anything from their ventilator settings, their drips, their devices or lack thereof, how ill the patient was overall, whether their blood pressure was labile, and there are a number of other factors. So this would create a score based on the points. We would add this up, and it would give us justification for a 1-to-2, a 1-to-1 ratio nursing, or sometimes even a 2-to-1 ratio nursing. And this is how we could prove to administration that we needed X amount of nurses in a unit and X amount of care provided to be safe for these patients. So with that in mind, I wanted a better way to provide my team and perfusion in general with a way to represent the challenges we face on a daily basis with, X case and Y case. So at Wellstar Kennestone Regional Medical Center, we started our open heart program in 2003. So we are not all that far along, or about 15 years to date now. So at year 13 in 2016, when I started there, I was brought on primarily to start an ECMO program there. Obviously, in 2003, it was primarily CABG and valves, spotty aortic cases here and there. Being a brand new program, selected patients. But obviously, times change. Fast forward to 2016, wide variety of cases. Valve, CABG, heavy aortic, and that's specifically because one surgeon that brings in all sorts of arch stuff, and we are actually very heavy arch caseload for this type of program we have, which has been an amazing opportunity to get to do some of these cases. New LVAD program that's about a little over a year old now, and a new ECMO program that's about just shy of 2 years. So clearly, lots of things going on in this situation. So if ever there were a time to capitalize on change, it would be right then. So most perfusion programs in the nation, I think it's pretty safe to say, work off of a flat fee, at least a blanket services charge for anything that perfusionists do, at least in the OR with surgical patients. So with that in mind, think about your feeling, your emotions when you walk into the OR early in the morning. You're the first person in. You look at the surgical schedule. It's a decent day. It's reasonable for your facility. You're the first case. You're assigned an AVR. It's a good feeling for most. I think it's pretty bread and butter case. You look at your H&P. It's straightforward. The patient just has aortic stenosis. You're thinking, this might be kind of nice. I might actually get a pretty decent straightforward case, hopefully, fingers crossed. Maybe even have time for 9 or even 18 holes in the afternoon or whatever you're into. It just depends. So think about that feeling. Then think about the other side of it. A 2 a.m. dissection, arch repair, whether it's a hemi-arch, it just all depends on what you have going on. Those two sides of things are clearly very different, but they receive the exact same charge, the exact same services charge. Are we doing the same work? Not even remotely. Those cases are treated differently. Now, could they be similar and comparable? Sure. But are they? The vast majority of the time, no. So with that in mind, what I tried to set out here is to actually create a discrepancy and a score-based system so that we can show that one case is infinitely more complex than another, and traditionally is. So with Acuity-Based billing for perfusion services, it's a point-based scale, just like I was talking about with Acuity for nursing, that will represent an overall charge that applies to billing for any particular case. So the points are applied for a type of case, and what I mean is whether it's a cabbage or a single valve, double valve, cabbage valve, any number of things like that will be scored. So what does it really mean? In case type and scoring, this is kind of the worksheet that we work off of, we've customized it to our center so that the average CT surgical procedure, or perfusion standby or MCS charge, would be covered based on our point scoring system. We developed these points based on the ranges that we'll talk about just in a second. But overall, this covers 99.9% of what we do at our center. And obviously, this is a live document, so it can be manipulated, it can be adjusted to your center. Obviously, there's things that are missing from there, like transplants and things that we don't do at our center, but could easily be added to that. So as far as case scoring goes, only one case itself is selected from the actual case list. And the reason is, you wouldn't want to modify your score midway through the case simply because you changed things. We have things called modifiers for that, and I'll elaborate on that in just a second. But your root base score of the procedure starts. If it's scheduled as an AVR, you score it as an AVR. If it changes mid-pump run, like you're coming off pump and your surgeon looks at the TEE and there's extensive MR and you got to go back on to replace that, it would be a modification later and an additional score added to the case. So as far as modifiers go, there are no limits. And I'll show you the list of modifiers in just a second that we've added. You can add as many as apply to the case as possible, and it will basically raise your score to the point that it will bring you to a new range and a new charge. So an example of that would be if you had, say, a cabbage AVR, that would score in our system as a 4-point case. It's simplistic when it comes to the actual case type scoring. It's pretty straightforward when you select that. And for that matter, we wanted to keep this as simple as possible to reduce that whole human error factor, which we all know is present. So modifiers are simply factors that add additional points of acuity to raise the level of difficulty when you're providing care for the patient. So it's a long-winded way of just saying, if they have organ system issues or low hematocrit coming into it, et cetera, we'll talk about that in a second, those are things that make our job harder. Anything that makes us have to, for lack of a better term, work harder, pretty much, justifies a higher bill. So modifiers can be things like a diagnosed CKD, use of cerebral oximetry, a BSA of 2.5 or higher, emergent initiation of CPV, which is obviously something that's going to be a lot more extraneous as far as dealing with that, and especially ECMO initiation, which is one of the higher point modifiers. So as far as modifiers go, at our particular facility, we're using 32 different modifiers. And you might see on the list some things that are pretty reasonable. Some things we included are additional valves, an unplanned cabbage that it's added to the procedure, an emergent case or emergent initiation of a case, which are obviously things that add complexity to the case itself. Anything from, without reading every single thing on there, it goes in graduation from a single point all the way up to 5 points if you have essential equipment failure in itself and having to change that out on bypass. And what this does is it adds up to an acuity point scale. So for simplicity's sake, I can tell you there were a lot more scales on the first draft of this, but it became kind of arduous. It became a lot more complex than it really needed to be, so we narrowed it down to 3 different scales here. So we've got a 1 to 4 score, a 5 to 9, or a 10 plus. And what those correspond to is a base score, approximately 13% higher than base, and about 19% higher than base. And it represents your graduated acuity. So base would be an example like an OpCab. It's a pretty common procedure at our facility, which would receive a base perfusion charge, which is extremely reasonable with no other modifiers raising the score. 5 to 9 would be something, an example of like a cabbage valve combo, or a case that starts with a score of 5 or higher. In this situation, it would be a cabbage valve, which would start with a score of 4. Say you have a patient with a BSA of 2.5, that adds a point. Maybe they're diagnosed with CKD in stage 3 or higher, so that adds an additional point. So you've ended up by the end of the procedure with 6 points, and now you're in the middle score. Or, we've all been there before, you have these cases that are, end up being disasters. An aneurysm that ends up being an ascending aortic replacement, you're on pump, it's an emergency in the middle of the night, it's a large patient, that's another point. The surgeon tells you once you go on, oh, by the way, you know what, I'm not going to be able to cross-clamp. I thought I was going to, so we're going to have to go to circ arrest at this point. So that's another added, unplanned situation. And then you try to come off pump, and you can't, so you have to transition to ECMO. So at that point, clearly this case is completely different than the other 2 examples there. Those points would add up to 11, which is on the 10-plus scale, and that'd be 19% more than your baseline charge. So again, back to this number. It's a little more clear now why the billables are a little bit higher, given the percentage difference. And it's going to be different from center to center, obviously, depending on what kind of acuity you do on average. If it's a smaller center that does primarily cabbages and valves, they're typically never going to, never going to raise their acuity that high. Then you may not, obviously, reach this kind of differentiation in billing. But for your larger centers that do high acuity cases, this could be invaluable when it comes to differentiating your billing. So it represents about a 24% increase from our old style of billing to 2017. And we did reevaluate the entire structure of cost and billing because the original charge existed from 2003, which hadn't been updated since that time. So with this in mind, the idea I came up with to actual implementation here started with brainstorming with my chief, Candace Kalin, who's actually talking tomorrow about a completely different subject, much more interesting, I promise. So we kind of came up with the idea, brainstormed. Like I said, we had multiple scales, but we narrowed it down to be much more simplistic and user-friendly. We tweaked the scale template, evaluated these modifier factors by having meetings with our staff, talking about common complications we see, things that make our job more difficult. We had a list originally over 100 different modifiers, which is just kind of crazy, of things that you can see in the OR, and narrowed it down to things that are much more common of a list of 32. But clearly it's a live document. There are things that we're actually evaluating now, adding to that as well. Things like minimal sternotomy approach for a mini MBR or mini AVR, things that technically do make your procedure harder and more difficult, but we haven't added it to that yet. We have to go through billing to make sure that would clear with them as well. But after tweaking and working with our billing department to reassign all perfusion charges to the different acuity levels, we made it active at the beginning, actually very, very end of 2016, but for the entire 2017 year. So we coordinated directly with them for this. The takeaway here, though, is it is a process of charging and it's not the end bill. So the question I know that I would receive if I didn't address it in here is, how do what's the response from insurance companies, Medicaid, Medicare, when they see these different levels of acuity? The key is they don't. They still see it as a single perfusion charge, a blanket charge, just like every other thing that we would normally do, every other facility. The difference is in process. The process of charging is where we use the acuity levels, and we actually enter it into Epic as a single blanket charge based on the acuity. So the end bill only sees perfusion charging X dollars. So they don't actually see, that we have a level differentiation, which is better for all parties involved, especially with the questions that would come from there. So in the end, it's a change in process, not an outcome. It is obviously customizable. It's going to be very center specific as far as what you charge and the acuity levels that you deem appropriate for your center. We're not, obviously, like I said earlier, we're not a transplant center. We don't have transplant procedures listed. We don't have certain other procedures that may exist at other centers. And then obviously modifiers can be customizable as well. There are things that occur at our center that may not occur at other centers and would be kind of pointless to include in the list. And another point I want to drive home is this is not simply for revenue generating purposes. Obviously it happened. I suspect over the years it's going to even out a little bit more. We're not going to see these big jumps from year to year. It's going to kind of be a steady change, which is good because we don't necessarily want to be 1.3 positive every single year. That is going to raise some eyebrows. So it's more to represent how complex our job can be and how different it can be in terms of care of the patient. Also, within time, it could even justify, when the need arises, to increase perfusion staffing. If you can prove, and I'm still getting this preliminary data from billing, if you can prove that you had 40% of your cases were that 10 plus acuity, and God forbid, I hope that happens to none of you. But if you can prove that that's the case, then clearly you're carrying a heavy load with your perfusion staffing. And that's another data point that you can use if you need to add an additional member in the future, which is actually precisely what we're doing at the present time. We don't have a position posted yet, but keep your eyes open. So obviously benefits, it's an ease of use with simple scoring. There's better representation of charges based on the complexity. There is a significant impact on perfusion services billing clearly with the number that I put up on the screen, and even more so with a high volume, high complexity caseload. So the data definitely shows recovered billable revenue on the former of flat fee billing. Something I did not include in here, and I want to address because it may be part of the questions as well. That's the billable revenue. What we don't have as far as numbers yet is the actual reimbursed dollar amount coming into the centers. We work on, and it's most centers too, work on a fiscal year July 1 to July 1. So we don't truly have a solid full year yet of straightforward data. But as soon as I do, I'll obviously integrate it into the presentation. Preliminary stuff that I can get from the VP of Billing so far is that we're looking pretty reasonable in the neighborhood of 60 to 70% on reimbursement fee, which is about in line with what you can expect from a mixture of private and public and government Medicaid, Medicare. So that's kind of a preliminary thing. So obviously there are some drawbacks. Human error is a factor. As far as scoring, we try to make sure everybody's trained, everybody's updated, everybody knows each modifying factor. Sometimes when you're doing this little quick score to enter your charges and go home at 3 a.m. after a big case, you skip through stuff and you miss things. It happens. It's not the end of the world, but it could be the difference between a single point that scores you 19% higher or 13% higher than base score. So there can be some money left on the table there. Smaller centers with lower volumes may not benefit as much from this versus a simple flat fee, and that's something that needs to be evaluated on a center per center basis. Obviously, with the conclusion here, it's a more specific and accurate bill, in my opinion, for perfusion services and a way to monetarily quantify your complex cases with an acuity scoring factor. So I think it's kind of a more modern take on perfusion services billing and can certainly be fine-tuned and refined as time moves on, and we certainly will keep doing it with the live document aspect of it. And again, you know, the take-home is with this reappropriation, we've obviously, I think, we're now on the right track with a 24% increase from the old versus the new way. So, any questions? I'm sure there are a few. And don't worry, let me have it. I set myself up for this, so feel free to pepper me with questions.
Bill Harris, New Orleans. Thank you. Excellent job. I knew that was a lot of work for you. And I'm glad that your billing department and administration is taking notice of your services. I think the best tool or the best solution for this, the best result of your study will be in your staffing models. I was wondering what your breakdown was of private insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, and compared to other hospitals. Because if no matter what you're billing, you're only going to be reimbursed the amount, as Al and I were saying, that with DRGs, yeah.
Sure. I don't have finalized factors on that yet, but that's actually something I'm working with as well for the breakdown specifically. The number that I got as far as that 60 to 70% of actual reimbursement is a mixture of private and Medicaid, or Medicaid, Medicare, so I don't have a breakdown separating the two. We have a pretty diverse patient population as far as a mixture of Medicaid, Medicare, and then private. So I suspect those numbers are going to shed a lot of light on that. I don't have them yet from billing, but I'm working constantly with them as they have finalized numbers to get that released. Yep.
Fantastic talk. I mean, as far as, you know, utilization and increasing your staff and, you know, a model for that and making people aware of what you do. My question is it a computer algorithm that you can plug in? Is it like, you know, done by coding, or do you have to do this manually on every case?
So kind of a mixture of the two. On each case, you would manually go through and score. We do have Excel set up so that it does it all for you. Once you click the boxes next to the point values, it auto adds all the points at the end, so you just look at the box and you know how many points the case is. What is actual coded is in Epic. So we had Epic actually create whereas we traditionally did our charges and simply check a box for perfusion services in the past. Now there are 3 different boxes that are perfusion acuity 1 to 4, 5 to 9, and then 10 plus, and those correspond with the billing charges that will then get put on the patient's bill.
And is this something that, once you have this algorithm already online, that you could share with other centers?
Absolutely. There's no secret. I'm not copywriting anything. I'm happy to share, what we have. Again, it's a live document, so you can use it verbatim, modify it for your center, yeah. But, I mean, clearly you need to, clear it through billing and talk with them about what's going on, because they're...
And I think it'll be interesting at the end of the year to see what your reimbursement based on your payer mix and your DRG reimbursement. So
absolutely,
that's going to be very interesting.
Yeah,
Thank
I suspect it'll
much.
certainly be lower than that number, but that number has nice, pretty shock value. So
it has a pretty value right there. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Thank you.